and I'm the local candidate for ACT Party for New Plymouth. And I'm so proud to be a candidate for ACT Party because I believe in freedom. And welcome to our top candidates, David Seymour, Nicole Mckee, and Simon Court. And thank you so much for everyone who helped organize tonight's evening. So let's welcome Nicole Mckee to be our first speaker.
Thank you, Ada, and thank you everyone who has come along this evening. What a fantastic turnout. I'd just also like to say kia ora to the viewers at home. We're live streaming at the moment as well, and that's because we've got a lot of popular stuff to tell you. Many of you know that I am the firearms spokesperson for the ACT Party, but I'm a bit more than that actually, because I kind of have a few issues that I like to get involved with. That includes hunting and conservation, welfare, employment. We need to get more ACT Party members in Parliament so we can spread the load a bit for some of these spokesperson roles. But hey, look, I want to talk to you a little bit about myself, who I am and why I've come here, why I've left Colfo to work with the ACT Party. It's the next step in the journey for firearms licensed owners. So many of the licensed owners out there know that, we've had a bit of a rough time, but in actual fact, whole of New Zealand's had a bit of a rough time. And it's not just about what's happened to the firearm owners with the loss of our property rights, our freedoms, our choices, and our ability to be heard without being prejudiced. It's actually starting to happen around the country in all sorts of minority groups. And I want to be a part of a party that is, where is our sign? There. It's all about freedom, freedom of choice, freedom of speech, and be able to maintain our property rights. The reason why I joined the ACT Party is not just because of firearms, but it's because of the erosion of a lot of those rights. And when I looked at the principles of the party, and I had David banging on the door, it was very quick and easy to see that this was the right place to be. Look, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the firearms legislation and where we want to go. I'm going to be quite brief with this because the guys want to come up and have a word as well. And I think we can have Q&A afterwards where I can address some of your more concerns around not only just firearms, but hunting and conservation and perhaps welfare as well. But guys, let me talk to you about what our priority is going to be in that firearms field. Should we be able to get enough people in behind David Seymour to give him an extra voice, to back up the principles that he alone has been voicing, mostly in some debates and mostly in some votes where he has stood up 119 votes against one. And firearm laws, of course, has been one of those. So look, let's keep it brief because a lot of you already know what's happened in that tranche, but I want to tell you what we plan on doing about it. Now, the first thing is you will realise we have had several sets of legislation that has gone through in the last 18 months. Legislation that has been knee-jerk reaction based on emotion and has really failed at good consultation. The ACT Party want to make a priority in any negotiation that we are able to repeal the Arms Legislation Act 2020. Now that's the last tranche of legislation that came through in June this year. That's the piece of legislation that brings in registration of firearms. Now, some of the non-licensed firearm owners out there may be asking, what is the problem with registration of firearms? Well, I'm going to tell you, I don't like the idea of my home and the contents in it becoming a shopping list for criminals. And quite frankly, we've already had data breaches where that information has been made available to the wrong people. I certainly don't want all of my information out there. But further to that, who's going to pay for that in this COVID world? where we already have a lot of debt? Well, it's going to be you nice folks, of course. You'll be paying for it with your taxes. And will it make a difference? Will it keep New Zealand safe, as has been promised? I'm going to tell you it won't. And part of the reason why is because registration simply does not work. I recently did an Official Information Act request of New Zealand Police, asking them how many firearms had been seized over the last 12 months. The reply I got was just over 3,000. Now that's good. That means 3,000 firearms have been taken out of the wrong hands and seized by New Zealand Police, and I congratulate them for that, and I hope they continue. But when I queried how many of those firearms had serial numbers on them for registration, only 1,500 of them did. So what is the point in having registration of firearms when in actual fact, half of them aren't? It's not going to make a difference. It's not going to make New Zealand safe, and it's going to cost us when we're already looking at a $140 million debt. It's simply not good enough. But wait, there's more. What else is in that piece of legislation? Well, as a firearms licensed owner, happen to be charged by New Zealand Police for an offence which could jail me for more than 3 months, I will lose my firearms licence for 10 years. I don't need to be convicted, I just need to be charged. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's fair that the police can come into my home with my children whenever they like because I have a firearms licence. I don't think it's fair that clubs and ranges are going to have policies put on them that may see some of them close. And if we do have ranges and clubs close, where are people going to go? Where are they going to sight in their rifles? Somewhere where it's not controlled. So we would like to see a repeal of this, because quite frankly, I don't like the idea that a firearms licence owner has less rights than a patched gang member. So it's not just about repealing that piece of legislation. It's what we're going to do with it afterwards. And guys, I'd like to explain it simply this way. If you think of the Arms Act 1983 that all firearms licence owners have to abide by as the tyre on a bicycle wheel, and with everything that has happened over the last 36 years, we'll call them punches on that bicycle wheel. With those punches, we've had wet bandages, really, just slapped on them to fix them. Now, those punches will be the Arms Amendment Act, they'll be the Arms Legislation Bill, they'll be the things around MSSA endorsements back in 1992 and other endorsements, they'll be about the air rifles and the pistol grip changes. We've had so many punches on this tyre that the integrity of the whole wheel has now been compromised. So what the ACT Party would like to advocate for is the rebuilding of a whole new set of arms legislation. Let's start by consulting, real consultation, because that happened back in the 1980s. It took 2 years to come up with a piece of legislation that lasted for 36 years. We would like to do that again. We've done it once, we can do it again. Let's take the really good bits of the 1983 Act, the really good bits of some of the amendments that have come through, consult with the community, with the stakeholders, with the police, even with the anti-gunners. Everybody deserves to be heard. Let's get together and come up with another piece of legislation that will last us another 40 years, and let's do it properly. And that's why I have come on board, because I have seen that with the Council of Licensed Firearm Owners, who work so hard for the rights of firearm owners, they've really just continuously had the door slammed in their face. Even when this latest government has said that they don't really care about property rights. Now, when I go on about the property rights, again, it's not just about the firearms. It's also about ammunition, but it's also about my mate who down in Wellington has just been told that 55,000 hectares of land that he has can now not be touched by him. Why? Because it's got a couple of trees on it that the council think are quite special. No, this is just simply not good enough. It's an intrusion on all of us, and it's starting in these simple little places where we are alienating our society and putting a divide between our communities. And quite frankly, that's not the Aotearoa that I grew up in. It's not the New Zealand that I want to stay in. I want to have back what I grew up with. I want my children to be able to say that they confidently live in a country where they can speak their mind, where they can keep their property, and they can legitimately go out there and kill a deer if they need to put food on their table like their mother did for them. I think that's important. And I also believe that many other people think the same way. So what we have here tonight is not just about firearms. It's also about hunting. It's also about conservation. It's also about property rights. It's about looking at the welfare state, how we have a government who is continuously feeding money into welfare instead of trying to prop everybody up by jump-starting the economy and get us moving again as one nation. We need to do this together, and the ACT Party want to do it with you. We want you to be a part of the process. So look, I'm just going to leave my little speech there, and at the end of this we'll have Q&As. I can see that there's a few hunters and gatherers and firearm owners that might have questions, but at the moment I'm going to hand over to David Seymour, welcome him on board, and thank you again for having us here tonight.
Well, look, thank you very much, everyone who's given up their time tonight to come out to this meeting, and those watching on Facebook. And I want to thank our local candidate for New Plymouth, Ada Zhao. Ada is a true believer in freedom, and her life story explains why that is. I think one of the most important things that New Zealand has to do in the coming years and decades is have Chinese Kiwis fully engaged in our democracy. And thank you, Ada, for taking that step. We're very pleased to have you on our team and representing the party here in New Plymouth. And of course, Nicole, thank you. Nicole is in many ways the embodiment of ACT values. Somebody who has gone about her life making a difference in her own life and the lives of those around her, often against considerable adversity. And she became the Communicator of the Year for 2020 when it was clear that our society had some real division created by the government. And I'm so pleased for our country and for our party that the person who came out to speak on behalf of firearm owners was a calm, rational woman who articulated the hurt and the position of people who were persecuted by the government for a crime they didn't commit in her inimitable style. So thank you, Nicole, for being here as well. But tonight we're actually here to talk about energy and resources. It's the launch of our energy and resources policy. And it's no surprise that we chose our bus stop tour in Taranaki to launch that policy. And you see, what Nicole talked about, the knee-jerk reaction of firearm owners, was not actually different from the way this government operates. It was just an acute example of populist, knee-jerk, unthinking regulation that damages people's livelihoods and ultimately puts lives at risk by making us less safe. Well, the oil and gas exploration ban, where the government decided to come out, no consultation, no cabinet papers, no cost-benefit analysis, no regulatory impact analysis, not a care in the world for the harm that government was doing to this community, just walked out into a podium like this, because we sort of have a podiumocracy these days, you may have noticed. And I don't know if many people here speak ancient Greek, but I'm reliably told that means power from the podium, podiumocracy, and announced that we were going to ban oil and gas exploration. And it's difficult to really sum up in one speech why that is such a stupid and dangerous thing. But I'm going to try. Look, first of all, the damage it has done to our international reputation. The oil and gas industry around the world know that New Zealand is not the easiest place to find and extract energy. But they also know that we are a country of honest dealers where your property rights are secure and the courts are trustworthy. And if you make an investment, you're in it for the long haul without needing to worry about Venezuelan-style political upset. The sovereign risk, as they call it, is smaller in New Zealand than just about any country, or it was. And then these guys come along. And it's not just the oil and gas industry, it's every industry that looks at New Zealand and thinks, geez, we thought we could trust these guys. Actually, they're running it like a bunch of clowns. They've got a populist prime minister who comes out to a podium and tries to make announcements without even thinking about the implications. It's a podiumocracy. I don't know if we want to invest in a podiumocracy. So that's the damage to the international reputation. Then there's the damage to this area. A lot of people, I'm a recovering electrical engineer myself, so I got some understanding, but a lot of people don't fully understand how sophisticated the energy industry is, how much technology and know-how and expertise goes to extracting energy and getting it to the surface in a way that's usable and, critically, that is safe. There are so many people downstream of the extraction process, and upstream of it for that matter, who actually depend for their livelihoods on certainty. And the damage to that certainty is absolutely devastating. The only thing worse is the insult of saying, don't worry, you can have a green school. Maybe you won't be able to get oil and gas out of the ground, but have you thought about crystals? I mean, seriously. We're going to activate your DNA. I mean, this is the government of New Zealand for another 33 days. Then we make some change. So the impact on the local area is terrible. But then there's the impact on the environment. And the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment made a report on the oil and gas exploration ban, said it'd probably make it worse. Well, that's an absolute disaster. The fact is that if they'd done some proper analysis before they came out to the podium, what they would have asked is, if we ban oil and gas exploration, what happens next? None of this stuff's complicated, by the way. It's just the people doing it or trying to do it are very simple. They'd ask, what happens next? Well, let's see. If we stop looking for new gas, we're going to run out of the old gas. And then we're going to need some substitute. Well, the hope is that, we will have invented super duper new technology. Well, as I said, I'm an electrical engineer and I hope the future is in new technologies. But history tells us that there's a lot more people predicting new technologies than inventing them. And that's why the future is always so disappointing. If you doubt that, let me ask you, how many people came here in a flying car? You go back to the 80s. We're supposed to have them by now and we don't. Just saying. Now, it's more than likely, whether we like it or not, that actually the substitutes for gas, if we run out of gas, will be Indonesian coal. And we know that's true because it's been happening in the last 2 years. They've been shipping it into Tauranga by the shipload, while the gas line between here and Huntly has been broken. So that's the reality. That we are going to stop having jobs and a sound international reputation for extracting gas here in Taranaki, so that Huntly, in the long run, will burn more Indonesian coal. Well, I tell you what, if climate change was Jacinda Ardern's nuclear-free moment, then with this policy, she just nuked herself. What a disaster. An own goal for the ages, actually having a climate policy that increases CO2 emissions. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. But then again, this is the government that gave you the green school. So there are so many reasons why the oil and gas ban was a disaster. But we're announcing our energy and resources policy tonight because, as with the fair firearms laws or the unfair firearms laws, it's actually just a symptom of a much wider disease. You see, our attitude to mining is absolutely horrendous, and it's hypocritical. Because, you know, these people who sign petitions against mining, you know, on their iPads made from minerals, they're not going to stop consuming the products of mining. Oh no, they just want to attack people, the nearest people they can find who are providing it for them. They still want it to come from somewhere. And the hypocrisy is that people keep consuming the stuff that mining produces. They just want it to be mined in countries offshore that have even more relaxed environmental regulations than ours. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And that for too long, this country has had far too many restrictions on the use of land, often for arbitrary reasons. One of those arbitrary reasons is that it's owned by DOC. Now, I have some inside knowledge on how conservation land came to be. And I got this from Richard Prebble, the former Minister of the State-Owned Enterprises. See, Richard is one of the craftiest politicians I've ever met. In many respects, a genius. And he became, as the Minister for SOEs in 1986, I think, responsible for the Department of Lands and Surveys. And they had a huge amount of land that was completely hopeless. No biodiversity, no conservation value, little farming value. And they said, what do we do with this? And Prebble, always being a thoughtful guy, and I think he's a genius, said, no problem. We'll tell everyone it's conservation land. And so they named it and batched it up as conservation land. Government conserves lots of land, got put into the DOC estate. Little did he realise, 30 years later, every misguided hippie in New Zealand would be protesting to protect it because it's conservation land. Well, actually, there's a lot of land out there that may be owned by DOC, but has very little biodiversity value. And what we should be doing as a country is maximising the revenue from that land so DOC has more money to protect real biodiversity, creating jobs, getting minerals, making iPads for people to protest against mining, if that's what they want to do, because even though that's stupid, we believe in free speech at all times, even for the stupidest people who use it. It's a matter of we're a party of principle, you know, standing up for idiots. Because they deserve the same defence as anybody else. You know? Oh man, I sometimes forget. Hi, Facebook audience. I sometimes forget that it's not just us; it's those guys too. But anyhow, let me just come back to the important point here is that our policy will solve that problem. We're going to get Simon up there in a moment to start being serious. And finally, the climate change policy. You know, I voted 1 against 119 on the Zero Carbon Act because it's not going to fix the problem. The problem with the Zero Carbon Act is that it is filled with trapdoors where the Minister for Climate Change can open up new credits if the pressure gets too intense. That's the first problem. And the second problem is that it politicizes our economy in a way we haven't seen since you had to get a license to import foreign goods or take money out of the country. Because that Minister for Climate Change can decide whether an industry or a particular plant lives or dies based on whether he makes an exemption. And when you give a politician that sort of power, two things happen. One is that it gets abused, and two is that people who like abusing power are attracted to the position. There's a great essay, Why the Worst Get on Top in a Socialist Society, and that's the reason. So this politicization of the economy and the Zero Carbon Act must be resisted. And we're going to talk about a climate change policy that maintains New Zealand's expectations from foreign countries, because realistically, there are international expectations on us, doesn't leak our jobs and industries to countries with less environmental regulations than us, and is administratively simple and avoids politicizing the economy. So those are the kinds of things you can look forward to in just a moment when Simon takes the stage and goes through our energy and resource policy. And after he's done that, we're going to do what we've done in every town on our bus tours so far, every town and city, is have a good old-fashioned Q&A, because I'm always eager to listen at least for half of the meeting. So we're going to talk for just over half an hour, and we'll spend the second half of the hour hearing the questions and concerns of local people, because ultimately, I think it's important that we come through this COVID crisis with a stronger democracy than we went in. I think it's important that democratic countries manage through the pandemic better than countries that are more dictatorial. And at the moment, it's not entirely clear who's winning that race. We need to use the strength of our multiple voices in our deliberative democracy to navigate our way through. And that's why we've also come to listen. Anyway, without further ado, I want to introduce Simon Court. Now, Simon, no, I've got to talk about you a bit first. So Simon is a reformed Green voter. And I want to tell you about the sort of diversity that we have amongst our top candidates. You know, amongst our top candidates, we've got 3 Ngāpuhi in the top 7. We've also got 2 vegetarians in our top 6. We've got 2 ex-Green voters in our top 5. And we've even got a guy called Chris Bailey, who's from the South Island. Now that is diversity, I know. So when we talk about diversity, we're serious, not like some people who just make token efforts. We got everyone. Now, Simon explains most of the diversity in our top 5. Not only there's a retired Green voter, but we believe in redemption. You know, it's the one thing that the ACT Party has in common with the Catholic Church. And we actually think that he's a real addition, because for a long time people have said, why can't we have a sensible, pragmatic Green Party that is based on practical experience of making the environment better, rather than based on hard left ideology? And that's Simon, because for 25 years, he has been a civil engineer working in wastewater, waste management. Someone said at our meeting at Otrahonga, they're pretty earthy there, he said, maybe he could sort out all the shit in Parliament. Anyway, good old Simon had experience. He was doing this, of working with people and saying, actually, you know what? What the Green Party says doesn't help us solve environmental problems, because the Green Party have never seen a regulation they don't like. They've never seen a problem that can't be solved by making a new rule. And actually, he's also an engineer, and he knows the way to solve all problems, including environmental ones, is more innovation, not more regulation. And many of the innovations we need are actually banned by regulation. So this is an original take on a non-ideological, pragmatic environmentalism in politics, something that we haven't had in our parliament, as far as I'm aware, ever. And so I think Simon Court is a name that you're going to hear a lot more of, because New Zealanders are environmentalists. We do have an environmental movement in this country, and it deserves better representation than wannabe communists masquerading as a political party giving you green schools. Welcome, Simon Court. Thank you.
Thank you, David. He sets up a great joke, and I'll do my best to deliver the punchlines. Thank you very much. So, look, David described some of the problems that we face in New Zealand with resource development and oil and gas. So when we think about how vital energy is to our economy, to our prosperity, it also underpins the highly skilled and highly paid jobs that we really value. So if we believe that we do need to transition our economy to a greener future, then we can only do that by actually playing our part. And that means that if we're going to be reliant on rare earth minerals and other resources, which largely are found in the South Island and in a few places in the Central North Island, we have very large stocks of lithium and other rare earth minerals, then we're going to need to take some courageous steps. And by courageous, I mean we're going to need to challenge some of the assumptions we've made about what conservation is and what biodiversity is. So one of the problems that we faced is that in order to get a new mine or a new resource extraction or a new quarry off the ground on the Department of Conservation land, that land which might have been Department of Lands and Survey or Farmlands or Land Corp back in the 1980s, it now sits in the dock bucket in what they call stewardship land. Applicants are forced to go through actually not one, but two consenting and approval processes. Of course, the Resource Management Act requires applicants to get a consent to manage their effects on water quality and to make sure they've got a good plan to put the biodiversity back and to restore a mine or a quarry at the end of its lifetime. But what the Department of Conservation does, it's also taken on the role of consenting, because rather than just focus on their primary role, which is granting land access, having stewardship of the land, having a governance role, and standing back and saying, look, we already have resource management law, we have a good process to make sure that the effects of activities are managed. What they do is they impose additional conditions on operators or those even seeking access to the private land. And for those of you who haven't had the misfortune of being involved in applying for consents for projects like I have, you must demonstrate you have land access permission before you can even lodge a consent application. So unfortunately, what we have with the Department of Conservation is that because they refuse time and again to give land access, even for visual inspections and basic investigations, it's not feasible for those organisations to then apply for consents. So what the ACT Party proposes is that we streamline the resource consenting and approval process. We limit the approval timeframes to 12 months, and that we put the applications into the same process that was used under a previous government to consent major projects like the Waterview Tunnel in Auckland and the Transmission Gully Road. That's called the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Now, John Key's government suggested that it would be far more practical to skip an entire resource consent process at regional council level and go straight to the EPA for projects worth hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. Because guess what? They were always going to end up in the Environment Court anyway. So what ACT says is, let's do that. Let's use the EPA process so that people who want consents for resource extraction, including operations on dock land, go through an EPA process, which means that all the submitters get to have their say. The science comes out. A dock also is free to be a submitter. But at the end of that process, the equation is settled. And unless there's been an error of law, then a decision should be made within 12 months. We think that's entirely fair on the applicant. And at this time of COVID uncertainty and economic uncertainty, it actually provides a pathway to jobs and employment and growing some of that wealth and prosperity that we're going to need to pay this enormous bill, these tens of billions of dollars that have been borrowed in just a few short months. So fast track consenting through the EPA. The other one that we propose, because guess what? We know that sometimes, despite their best efforts, some organisations, some companies can't meet their obligations. So what ACT proposes is that if you want to mine on conservation land, you have to put up a bond. Now, currently that's with the regional council. We can't have two bonds. So what we would propose is that an agency like MB actually has responsibility for managing those bonds rather than having two agencies like DOC and regional councils both asking a mining company, particularly a New Zealand-based one that doesn't have all of the resources of a big multinational, asking a company to pay two bonds to two different organisations. We think that government can actually be far more efficient than that. In terms of restoration, we've seen some wonderful mining restoration in New Zealand. We've seen projects currently at Reefton, a former gold mine there, restored in under 3 years with biodiversity enhancements that are world-class. And we think that that's something that New Zealand can be proud of and that we can use as a model going forward. Now, oil and gas. ACT has always said that we will repeal the ban on oil and gas. But I just want to reflect on why it's so important. Now, because we're speaking to other people as well as the people of Taranaki here in this room who might not understand the significance of oil and gas, I'll just give you a few examples. New Zealand farmers rely on urea fertiliser. That's actually quite an environmentally friendly fertiliser compared to the ammonium nitrate, which I'm not sure if you saw what happened in Beirut a few short weeks ago to that fertiliser stockpile in a warehouse. Urea is a friendly alternative to ammonium nitrate, but we can only produce it using natural gas. And it's produced right here in the Taranaki. So we need natural gas, not just to keep the fires on in our homes, keep the power stations going, but also to produce those raw materials that our primary production sector relies on. I'll give you another reason why we need natural gas, because it's a catalyst for manufacturing our own diesel and petrol here on shore at Marsden Point. We cannot manufacture oil and gas without we cannot manufacture our own fuels here without natural gas. So I think it's really important to reflect, if we want to be a self-reliant and self-sufficient economy at this time when the strategic environment out there in the world is uncertain, then we need to make sure that we maintain energy self-reliance. So it's really important that the voters of New Zealand understand there is a party, the ACT Party, who actually understands the science, understands the technology, and can stand up and represent them in these discussions about why it's important that we secure these energy sources, not just now, but for our future. Climate change, carbon zero. Now, I worked at Auckland Council, as well as many years in the private sector, but my time at Auckland Council is one of the reasons why I'm here, standing for ACT. Because while you hear mayors and others proclaim a climate emergency, it's not till you work in one of those organisations, and dare I say, I believe the Ministry for Environment is also staffed by these people, who would be just at home on an Extinction Rebellion march, gluing themselves to the road as they are giving advice to business leaders and elected members and councils and government. And so if we're going to accept that their narrative is the narrative that guides public policy making in New Zealand, then we're stuffed. So it's really, really important that ACT has a much stronger voice in Parliament and in the public discourse to raise these issues. So climate zero sounds great. ACT has an alternative vision because we know New Zealand has to do its part. Our international customers depend or demand that we meet their expectations. We have to have a climate change policy. But ACT actually has a policy that is a common sense climate policy. What we propose is, rather than letting Minister James Shaw jack up the price to $35 a tonne, as he did in a recent announcement from the podium a few weeks ago, what ACT proposes is that we would take an average of our top 5 competitors and we would adopt their carbon price. Now, Australia typically charges about $5 a tonne carbon to offset some of their emissions. And that was perfectly reasonable in New Zealand until this government came to power. It seemed about right. But some of our other trading partners include China, who don't have a carbon price at all. So if we want our industries like steel manufacturing and others to be competitive, and so that we can actually supply New Zealand from New Zealand manufacturers, then we're going to need to level the playing field for them. Otherwise, what we'll find is that we're entirely reliant on imported manufactured goods from those kind of countries which have far worse environmental, human health and social responsibilities than we do. So look, again, I just want to reflect. It's really, really important that we focus on the things that ACT can deliver to New Zealand that other parties cannot. That 119-to-1 vote against the Zero Carbon Act is an example of why we can't rely on the red, blue, and green parties to deliver for the environment or the economy. So what I would ask you, when you're considering who to vote for this election, is to consider that giving your party vote to ACT will give ACT a much stronger voice in Parliament to say what needs to be said about these really important matters so that you can be confident that we will stand up for you in Parliament and represent the sectors that actually power the New Zealand economy. Thank you very much.
Well done, Simon. He's the only candidate so far that remembered to ask you to actually vote for us. So, congratulations. Look, let's hear from you. What do people have on their mind? There may be questions about things we've talked